From Creamer Media's Polity, I'm Shannon de Ryhove. I'm chatting to Dr. Greg Mills of the Brenthurst Foundation, who will be discussing government's new growth path. Welcome, Dr. Mills. Many from the left and the right of the South African political spectrum have been very critical of the recently announced new growth path. You, however, don't adopt a critical tone. Rather, you suggest how best the new growth path can be made to work. Is that a correct interpretation of your intervention?
Yeah, I think so. I think obviously there's some problems with the growth path, both from the perspective of the left and the right. But you have to ask yourself, what is the alternative for South Africa? And I think the growth path manages to steer a route somewhere between the polarized critiques in South Africa, and it comes up with some fair answers. It doesn't come up with all the answers. It doesn't come up with all the answers as to why previous initiatives have failed, of course, which in a sense is the way forward for South Africa. But it does, in a sense, chart a route forward.
Now, one of the points that you emphasize is that there is no political will to make the plan work, and that it will go the way of other well-intentioned documents. Do you think this is a real danger?
I think without political will, I think there is a danger. It's simply going to go the way of GEAR and all the other well-meaning initiatives that South Africa has had. Esgisa, in a sense, has also gone that same way. I think what the World Cup showed in South Africa is that with the right political will, we can achieve an enormous amount. We can actually almost defy the odds and defy international belief in terms of what we as South Africans can achieve. The real question is, can we translate that political will into something like a growth strategy which demands both political compromise on the one hand and political leadership on the other? Is the government willing to use its political capital to, in a sense, convince, coerce, if necessary, the unions to do this, and to take them along in this process? And that, I think, remains the core question of all, in terms of whether this will work and whether, in fact, it can chart a route forward for South Africa.
Now, you've mentioned the World Cup. What lessons specifically can South Africa learn from hosting that event, and how does this relate to the new growth path?
Well, I think in the World Cup it showed that South Africa can pull together as a nation and can be very single-minded in its determination to actually achieve something as prestigious as the World Cup. Of course, there was a tremendous amount of pride, of political face at stake had South Africa failed. So it really had to pull out all the stops to make it happen. The real question is there the same amount invested in something like a new growth path? Does the government have the same amount of political capital invested in it? Does it have political capital to utilize to this end? I think what we saw in the World Cup is, despite the fact that on paper the capacity of the police force was very low, for example, with the right push, with the right political leadership, the police were in the streets, there were no serious incidences to speak of, and we showed the world what was possible in South Africa. We showed South Africans what was possible, and that was a very heartening moment as a South African. But I think to go back to the growth path is do we have the same level of political will in terms of taking the left, the South African Communist Party, the unions, who of course are protective of their position and are a core mobilizing element within the ANC, along on issues like a wage cap, like more flexible wage rates for workers, so that we are able to improve productivity to wage rates and in a sense take on the world and take on the other developing markets. We have to do this if we're going to be able to deal with the scourge of our society. And the scourge of our society is really poverty and inequality. South Africa, almost half of South Africans of a job-going age are unemployed or don't have formal employment. And that is clearly a situation that is not sustainable politically. It's not sustainable socially either. And we see that in high rates of criminality in our society. So something has to be done, or something will give.
You note that the new growth path identifies some interesting areas of growth. Can you elaborate on that?
Well, it identifies, new traditional areas of growth, mining and so on. But the fact that the green economy and agriculture and tourism all have received emphasis is one thing in terms of a sectoral analysis. The other more interesting thing is our macroeconomic policy aspects like inflation targeting, the need for a wage cap, and so on. Those are very important elements. And in a sense, it almost brings South Africa's future development trajectory in line with what the Treasury has been trying to do, which is maintain South Africa's macroeconomic prudency over the last 15 years, in a sense, and translate this into a growth strategy for a wider number of South Africans trying to deal with this issue of unemployment and with this widening issue of inequality. South Africa is, of course, not alone in facing inequality, but we are stuck in the top 5 most unequal societies in the world. And all 5 of them are in Africa, and 4 of them are in Southern Africa. Angola, South Africa, Botswana, and Namibia. We certainly have to do something about this. We've seen the costs of not dealing with inequality around the world. It leads to political instability. It leads to social unrest endemically. And certainly South Africa has to do something about this. But another question, of course, in all of this is, does the government have not only the capacity, but does the political leadership in government have the ability to pull government together, making sure that all the ministers are joined up together to try and realize the objectives of such a growth path? There's a tremendous amount of infighting, as is to be expected in any government. There are fiefdoms, there are different ministers with different ambitions who see different bits of government policy as their territory. Can they, in a sense, subcontract that to an overarching government growth strategy, such as the new growth path? That is, I think, a moot question in South Africa's case.
You say that any realistic growth path should invariably focus on the sort of fiscal prudence and macroeconomic policies adhered to by South Africa's Treasury. You also argue for greater labour market flexibility. Please elaborate on these ideas.
Well, I think one of the problems we have in South Africa is we have a very small tax base. And we have structural unemployment for sort of 13 to 15 million people. They're people who find themselves on a form of social welfare grant, whether it be pension payments or child support schemes and the like. We have an individual tax base of roughly 5 million people. I mean, these are 2 worlds that South Africans find themselves in. How do we get the 13, 15 million people into the 5 million people strong economy? How do we get them to break out of what's become a way of life? And I think the answer has to be both in terms of providing the conditions around infrastructure and around policy and trying to encourage investors into South Africa, but it also has to be to show a certain degree of flexibility as gradated steps on the way to full employment. Now, there are a number of different ways of achieving this. Colombia has done something very interesting recently, which is offer tax breaks for employers for first-time employees over a limited period of time. And that has helped dramatically, and now it's law in Colombia, and it's helped dramatically to try and get people who otherwise would have been, in a sense, structurally unemployed in their society into work, and enabling, in a sense, them to get onto the first ladder of formal employment and then walk their way up it to greater skills and so on. We have to find a way, whether it's wage flexibility or whether it's tax flexibility, a way of actually getting South Africans into the formal labour market. Otherwise, they're going to be stuck in this tale of 2 societies in which we find ourselves. Those who live in the rural areas, those who live in urban poverty, and those, in a sense, who live in this first world economy, who pay tax, who lead completely different lives. It's the difference, if you want, between grinding endemic poverty in the rural areas and eating sushi from the belly buttons in the cafes of Sandton. These are 2 different worlds. It's got nothing to do with race. It's got everything to do with your ambition and how you get in to become a normal player in South Africa. And we have to sort of, in a sense, find a middle ground between these 2 worlds of dearth and excess. And how do we do that, I think, is the challenge for all South Africans of various generations. Otherwise, we're going to go forward for the next 20 years of dealing with 2 societies and all the consequences and problems that go with it.
Well, thank you very much for your input, Greg.
Thank you.